Everybody can hear me? I'm going to move around a little bit. This is a beautiful space, so I think we should use it. Let's explore the possibilities of this space and all the screens in it. Let's get vulnerable this afternoon. I'm Matt Demers. I'm an architect from Chicago, but before I moved to Chicago, I got a PhD at the University of Florida, where I studied under Greg Ulmer. And my research is an application of Ulmer's Heretics, the logic of invention, which is his digital rhetoric, to architectural history analysis. And that application is something that I call cyber history. As Liz Losh brought up to introduce the symposium, cyber actually comes to contemporary usage through Norbert Wiener's cybernetics, the study of self-guiding systems. And he got that root, Kubernetes, from Greek, Kubernen, to steer, Kubernetes, helmsman. It's also the same root in government. That's where we get that. And so basically, cyber history is history that's used as a guide. And I would say that it has always been a part of historiographical research to use precedents in contemporary problem solving. The problem is that aspect of historiography is always excised out of the goals of historiographical research, and historicism tends to not want to look at how we use history for the production of new things, particularly new methods of making. So again, cyber history is applied heretics. Heretics, just very quickly, that term comes from 17th century Richard Bertholge, ratiocination, speculative. He posits in this quote the definition of hermeneutics, which is the logic of interpretation, and at the same time, he posits this other word, heuretic, which is the logic of invention. And we've picked up and used hermeneutics quite a bit, this notion of interpretation and its relationship to the production of meaning and in classical rhetoric. But this logic of invention, heuretic, never really went anywhere. There isn't sort of a rhetoric or a logic of invention as such, and it's one of the things we're here discussing this weekend is what we do with that. So again, digital rhetoric, logic of invention, heretics. For Greg Ulmer, hermeneutics is extremely good at taking discrete material and data and using it to construct concepts and theories. The logic of invention, through interpretation, the logic of invention in digital media would be extremely good in the construction of new methods based on theories that come from hermeneutics. So it's posited as a supplement to hermeneutics. One of the concepts that I use the most, there are several different things, several different key concepts from cyber history that I can take from Greg Ulmer's work, but one of the ones that I use the most is the cat generator. This is something that Greg Ulmer put forth to simulate our inventio, or what the human brain does to invent new methods every day. We do this all the time. It's just a way to simulate the materials that syncretically we cobble together in our brain to propose a new method. And he, through analysis of various discourses on new methods, found 5 common components in how people, 5 things that people need to propose or think about, model a new method before they test it. They need a contrast. That's something that specifically they do not want to do. It's an anti-example. They need an analogy, which is a good example of what they like to do from a different field. So a good way of working, but something that's not directly applicable in your field. They need a theory. That's a set of concepts and terms from your field that you can use to aid in legibility and communication. You need a target, which is your audience, and you need a tail, which is the final format. You have to communicate your method to somebody, whether that's a manifesto is a common one. The discourse on method is a common one, but you could have any format. You could make a sculpture, you could make a video, you could feasibly study any kind of format for communication of your method. What I was always interested in was not just the production of methods using the cat generator, but also the possibility of analyzing previous methods. So analyzing historical precedents using the cat generator to uncover the method experiments that produced previous objects. This is extremely important and applicable in architectural history because as architects, practicing architects, and also teachers of design, we use history constantly. we still teach Greek architecture, even though we're not supposed to be imitating Greek architecture. People still learn about it. We study the history of architecture and our precedents constantly, not just for historiographical purposes, not to document them, not to archive them, but ostensibly because we're going to use some aspects of those precedents in new things. The reason Heretics works so well for discourse in architecture, far better than almost any existing rhetorical discourse in architecture, is because architecture is inherently multimodal or multimedia. We write about it, we speak about it, but the buildings themselves are fairly mute. The architect isn't there, but they certainly affect us. And so a lot of the communication of buildings or any meanings or feelings that people get from them are through material, light, the sound of spaces, the shape of the spaces, as well as anything that people might say or write about them. And in architecture, whenever we engage in a new project, or in any kind of design, I would argue that to tackle a problem or engage some very complex project, what we have to do first is propose a method for actually navigating that problem. It doesn't exist. There's no single roadmap for how complex programs will become a building on a particular site. We have to cobble that together based on a variety of different inputs. Most of my application of cyber history and heretics for my dissertation went into analyzing Le Corbusier's career. He was, love him or hate him, he's one of the founding fathers of heroic international modernism. Man made hundreds of buildings, published 50 books, hundreds of articles, dozens of exhibits around the world. He is the largest icon and purveyor of the ideas and ideologies of architectural modernism. So there's certainly a great deal of legibility, at least in my field, and also outside of architecture. A lot of people know who Le Corbusier is. And like most of the avant-gardes of the early 20th century, when he was practicing, late 19th, early 20th century, died in 1965, the early 20th century avant-gardes were constantly engaged in method experiments. And modernists in particular were trying to engage new media, new materials for construction to produce new ways of working that were not available in any of the historical precedents, like Greek temples don't tell us anything about how to use steel and glass and concrete to make a building. And so when these materials became available at the end of the 19th century for the first time, completely new techniques and ways of thinking about space became possible, but nobody had a way of working. They had not yet seen the language. They didn't understand it completely. They needed to come up with methodological experiments to test it. And so modernism, like any ism, I would argue, is a method or a way of working. They are not objects. It's not a style. It's a method. And almost every single building, every single painting, every single sculpture by these early avant-gardes are experimental method proposals. They're not objects, or probably they shouldn't be evaluated as objects. That's missing a lot of the point and the meaning. Are we back? And we're back. Okay. There's a divide in Le Corbusier's legacy between his individual smaller scale designs, like this house, the Ville Sauvage from 1929, one of his early masterpieces of modernism. For the most part, people still use his individual buildings as valuable precedents. Today, you can find ones that you love, that you hate, but there's a language and a set of ways of making and ideologies that are still current for almost every single architect. It's completely different with the legacy of his larger scale proposals. For him, modernism is a way of producing the industrial world that existed at literally every single scale, from the production of small objects, books, furnishings, houses, and also entire cities had to be rethought with new materials, with industrial technology, with changes in labor. We had to really think about how these things affected the existing historical built world. His larger proposals like this, Vilradius, also from around the same time as the Ville Sauvage, these had been vilified for decades, and actually they were so hated, they were used as the cornerstone contrast for the production of postmodern ideologies in the late 60s and early 70s. Le Corbusier's modernisms and the notion of modernism at the city scale in general was seen as a massive failure, to the point where it was ritually killed by architects and urbanists. Here you see the destruction of the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex in St. Louis in 1972, used by Charles Jenks as basically straw man or fodder for the desire to move away from modernism. And I would argue that the actual production of housing complexes like Cabrini Green or Pruitt-Igoe has nothing to do with a method experiment like Vilradius, but they have a formal similarity. They look similar. They were proposed to be similar, and that formal similarity was extremely persuasive, but it tells us nothing about the differences in how they were made, the different stakeholders, how people used these buildings, how they were funded. So early on, the test for cyber history was for me to see if I could use my analyses, CAD analyses, and uncovering methods to actually produce a new method to solve a problem. And at the time, while I was busy architecting, I wanted to solve a particular problem. In North Central Florida, it's extremely hot and humid most of the year. It's very hard to remain comfortable in interior spaces with that kind of heat and humidity. Also, in the summertime, there's almost no wind at all, so you can't really ventilate. Now, the way we tend to do it now is this thing on the bottom that I call a total recall strategy. We insulate, completely isolate the interior from the exterior, and then we pump it full of energy, and we use HVAC systems to heat or cool that space, completely isolated. That was only available since the 1960s. Before the 1960s, anybody that wanted to try to be comfortable in Florida had to use the complete opposite strategy, which you see at the top, which is the Florida Cracker House, which is open to any available and all available crosswinds. So you have to really pay attention to orientation, not just to sun, but also to available wind throughout the year. And then it also uses stack ventilation or thermal displacement, which is the notion of the hot tin roof. The roofs were made of tin. They would bake in the sun. The overhead space could get up to 200 degrees actually, but the floor was also extremely porous, and there was a crawl space under the house. And so it was shaded all the time, making it at least maybe 5 to 10 degrees cooler sometimes than the surrounding air, and a lot cooler than the overhead space. And so if you vent the hot air out the top, inside you'll actually be sucking cold air from under the house into the space, passively creating currents that can cool the space. The problem is you can't do both of these things at the same time, because for HVAC systems to work, you have to completely seal the building. So most existing buildings in Florida were sealed, were pumped with energy in HVAC systems, and because they're fully insulated, you can't then open them up to any kind of cross breezes and things like that. So I had this notion of I need to find a way to propagate in a manner that could be popular and useful to any architects and clients designing in Florida, a way to do both of those two strategies at the same time. I had to propose a method. So I chose to analyze or use as a test case Le Corbusier's 5 points of modern architecture, because it is probably the most effective way to describe his modernism. The format is what made it so, I think, persuasive and memorable to people around the world, is it was just 5 simple points that like a checklist, if you applied all these principles to your design, it would get you toward the production of something that made use of new technologies and materials in building. In other words, you could produce a modern architecture, and you had a method to do so by following 5 points. So almost every architect today knows the 5 points, even if they're not a modernist. They can actually recite these, and a lot of people that aren't architects know most of the 5 points. It's that effective. So I said, okay, maybe I should use 5 points. So I won't go through the inputs and the outputs of the method experiment that I ran. You can see some of them here. The first step is to analyze Le Corbusier's 5 points, everything he wrote about them, lots of things other people have written about them, and try to come up with what his cat generator inputs were. And then we try to flex it. We say, can we run most of the components of this experiment one more time in a slightly different experiment that makes sense for the method I'm trying to produce? And so there's almost 100 years difference between the proposal of these two methods. So I had to move things around to make them relevant to my particular method, but I tried to maintain most of the components. As you can see here, most of them are the same. Some of them are flipped around. The method is something I called spectacular vernacular. And so I can run the experiment, which I did, which you'll see here. This is, look at that, that's great. This is the output of running the method experiment the first time. Now the proposal wasn't just to design this thing, but to use this method experiment in architectural studios, that the spectacular vernacular then becomes a component in each student's proposal of a new method. And so the spectacular vernacular in the design studio becomes the common theory. It becomes the common set of principles that everybody will use in their new method experiments for proposing other ways, other methods for doing both of the cooling strategies that we saw before. Most of the other components for the method experiments can remain the same. Some of them can change. So basically everybody doesn't only just produce a design, they produce and articulate a method of producing almost infinite instances of that design on different sites. And so I won't go into the details, the technical details of my 5 points, but I tried to make 5 very simple points that anybody who spent any time in North Central Florida or the southeastern United States would probably be able to relate to all of these things. They've seen these things before, they've experienced them, they know they work, to say, okay, I think we can actually use this as a method for producing low energy, but also low cost houses for this climate. And around the same time, an opportunity came about to use this as a design build studio where the students would propose methods, but then eventually we'd whittle it down to a single overarching method and actually produce the construction documents, and then eventually produce the students who designed the building would help to build the house for a family. And the city of High Springs showed interest. Their city planner was heading up Douglas neighborhood development, complete redevelopment of a historic African American neighborhood in High Springs, which is just about 20 miles north of Gainesville, where the University of Florida is. And they were trying to redevelop this historically impoverished section of one of Florida's older cities. It's a 19th century city, and Habitat for Humanity was involved. They had a developer to produce a lot of different typologies of affordable housing so that most of the people who were currently living there could continue to live there in better conditions, and then also find a lot of other people from surrounding communities to come in and buy homes. So I was able to get a number of stakeholders from the city, including the city planner, the mayor, the developer they contracted, and the president of the community association, to sit down and listen to a presentation about the spectacular vernacular. And they were actually all on board for making at least one of these properties buildable through the design build studio at the University of Florida. So we would be able to produce something for a family from this neighborhood who would then also be able to live in a low-cost, low-energy home. They gave us that site. It was sort of a perfect site. We had to run the experiment one more time because initially, when we met with the members of the community, they thought this one looked like a spaceship, not a house. They said we would like something that looks more like a house. And to them, house meant the traditional craftsman bungalows of High Springs in North Central Florida. You can see sort of an abstracted version of that housing typology. They wanted houses that looked like that. So basically the format for the next iteration of the method experiment wasn't just a single family home. It had to be something that was identifiable to the community as a craftsman's bungalow. And it also had to be a little bit larger because we were doing it for people who expected to have 2 to 3 bedrooms and 2 baths. They wanted the stuff from all the houses they keep seeing everybody else have, but they've never gotten to have. They wanted something more like a suburban home. So the format for the next iterative method experiment gave them something legible in the interim that they could believe in as something that could be theirs. But due to a variety of very, very nasty political circumstances in High Springs, all an election of people who rhyme with the Tea Party were put in place in the city government. It basically stopped all public work in the city, mismanaged it to the point that the state of Florida almost reabsorbed it back into the county for administrative purposes. So not only did the development stop, Spectacular Vernacular as a design build studio got put on hold indefinitely. But because this isn't just a single design, it's a series of method experiments, it's hard to kill it. So the city planner who was at High Springs when I proposed this, he was chased out of town being a government employee. He was chased out with torches and pitchforks. Him and his family fled to Jacksonville, where he's a city planner now. And I was on the phone with him just a few weeks ago, and he has opportunities for developments in Jacksonville area where they might be able to actually use the Spectacular Vernacular principles. So hopefully if those come through, we can do the design studio and we might actually be able to build one of these things. Thank you.